Okay, so look, let's get started. We got today's Thursday, April 25th. This is the 1 week anniversary of the release of the Mueller report, the redacted Mueller report. It seems like ages ago, if you've been following it on the media. It's like the virtually the top story every single day, every single hour. In addition to the now 20, I think, people that are running for the Democratic nomination. So that a week ago, last Thursday, just after having gotten the copy of the redacted report, we obviously criticized William Barr for his then transparent effort to deceive everybody about what the nature of the findings were, pointing out that it was totally untrue, that his assertion that the failure on the part or refusal on the part of Mueller to bring any charges against Trump had absolutely nothing to do with the White House legal opinion that said that it was not allowed for a Justice Department employee to bring criminal charges against the president. It became manifest upon even a cursory reading of the redacted Mueller report that was in fact central to the reason why Mueller did not return any charges under the obstruction of justice volume. And so we criticized Barr for trying to deceive the American people to that effect. We also criticized Barr for his patently false assertion that there was no evidence of any kind to support collusion, and that therefore there was no collusion and no obstruction. Therefore, parroting the kind of bumper sticker position of Trump on all of this. So we point out that was the second ground for critiquing Barr. His reference to there being no evidence to support either one of those was not true at all. That it was clear from a reading of the report that what Mueller had concluded is that in light of the technical requirement to find a conspiracy to show what was referred to as collusion with Russia, there would need to be an agreement, an express agreement reached between the two conspiring parties before he could actually bring a criminal charge. Yes?
Sorry, I'm going to sidetrack you. If Mueller did find some sort of evidence that would convict Donald Trump, would there be a sort of a separate trial for that, or is that all just part of the impeachment proceedings?
In fact, he addressed it. What he said is that, look, that assuming there were evidence here, for example, when he was talking about the obstruction thing, assuming that there's evidence here that would support a criminal charge, which I'm prohibited as a Justice Department employee from bringing against him, there are two things that are important to talk about. One is that the Congress has the ability to bring impeachment charges against him, the House, and then he'd be tried in the Senate and he could be convicted there, the only punishment for which would be his removal from office. But he went on at length to point out that subsequent to his leaving office, either by impeachment or the expiration of his term or terms, he would be subject to criminal prosecution. And he went out of his way to point out that that was true, which is indicative of the fact that he was really intending to have this be a roadmap for the Congress. So in addition to those criticisms that we leveled at Barr, which seem to be parroted by virtually everybody now, about how bogus his first 4-page report was, a summary, and then his attempted summarization just before releasing the report in its unredacted or in its redacted form. So everybody rushed in to critique Mueller, even to the point where a number of members of Congress have now called for his impeachment, which you can do. You can impeach any officer that has been consented to by the Senate pursuant to the Constitution. But in addition to that, we, more surprisingly, critiqued Mueller for Mueller having basically booted the collusion charge by pointing out there was this technical requirement of having a conspiracy and a specific agreement between the two parties in order to criminally prosecute them, and that he, in effect, disappeared that charge at the end of volume 1. Just said that here's what happened, here are the facts that happened, and that I'm unable to find a specific agreement, therefore I can't charge conspiracy, so therefore let's get on to volume 2 and take a look at the obstruction charges. And it was there that he laid out this big roadmap for these 10 different instances that had occurred that clearly would rise to the potential of being an obstruction act. And therefore, here's what the Congress needs to do. Here are all the elements to it. Here are the cases on both sides. It was a transparent roadmap that he put forth. But the criticism remained at the end of our initial gathering together about that this booting of the collusion charge did not seem, in my judgment, to be merited. And because of that, they were refusing to answer the question that people keep posing. What in the world is going on here that's causing Trump to be so enamored of Putin? And why does he refuse to criticize him? Why does he always congratulate him? Why does he always, hold him up to esteem? Why does he take his word for everything? What's going on there? And if, in fact, there was no collusion or no conspiracy between the two of them, why would he keep doing that? And what we did is we predicted, after the criticism of both Barr and Mueller, we predicted exactly what was going to happen, is that the Democratic Party, yes?
Before you get too far in, do you want to just mention the paper real quick?
Oh, yeah, all right. So the papers are all due today, the global climate change papers. And so that those will be coming in all today. And what we're doing now is we're starting you on the trip to deal with the impeachment, which is the second element of this. And as you can see, I've been concentrating on this because it's going to be such a centerpiece for the course. But I'm going to, in fact, in the gatherings that we have later, start making the connection. I'm going to start making it more today of how this is related to climate change directly, because we predicted that there was going to be this split in the Democratic Party, that the new, more moderate Democratic Party, the post-Cold War Democratic Party, headed up now by Nancy Pelosi and Schiff and the rest of them, and now Joe Biden, now that he's announced this morning that he is clearly seen as the choice of the new, more moderate Democratic Party to be the nominee for that part of the party. We predicted that they were going to go saying, look, no impeachment, even though the content of the redacted Mueller report is much more critical of President Trump than Barr was indicating in his 4-page and in his summary of it all. When you really look into it, it's a lot more incriminating, but we should not go to impeachment. We should have this kind of strange dance where we're not saying we're going to impeach him. What we're saying is all we're trying to do is get the information. First, get the information out from behind the redactions, then get the information that underlies the findings, the factual findings of Mueller, such as the particular interviews, the hundreds of interviews that he did of witnesses, et cetera, and that we predicted that was what they were going to do. And they were going to say that this process of getting more information that undergirds the Mueller report, they're going to be holding hearings, which they think they can then slow walk, all the way up to the election, and that they're going to be presenting more and more incriminating information about Trump. And that way it's going to undermine the independents primarily, who voted for him in 2016. There's an acknowledgement that the hardcore of really about 18%, maybe 15 to 18% of the people support him affirmatively, but because only half of the people in the country vote, that 15 to 18% ends up looking like 30 to 40% of the people. And so you keep hearing these quotes about, 40% of the people support him, But we knew that was going to happen with the regular Democrats. And we also predicted that there was going to be this different position taken by the progressives, the so-called progressives, and they always refer to it as the progressive wing of the Democratic Party now. This is the AOC group, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the new freshman members of the House and members of the Progressive Caucus. Were in fact going to say that they believed that the evidence put in front of us, the findings of fact made by Mueller, support an impeachment, like right now, that it's right in front of you, so that we would be actually violating our constitutional oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States if we were to allow this to go on. But as we predicted, it turns out they took the bait, and they went right down the road of the obstruction. And that virtually all of the discussion of the progressives, even including AOC, are talking about the obstruction, and that they're looking to see which is one of their favorites of the 10 different obstruction events. And of course, Don McGahn has now become the hero. He's become the star witness because he is the eyeball witness to the obstructions, most of them. And so everybody's raising up Don McGahn. Everybody's talking about how quickly can we get Don McGahn to come on to testify. What is it Don McGahn actually said? And so that what's happened is the progressives have bought into the argument that there is no really provable collusion, and no matter how much cooperation or coordination or solicitation was going on between Russia and the Trump administration, that there's no proof of conspiracy. And so therefore, let's drop that and turn our attention to the roadmap that he's given us. So just as we predicted, that has happened. And what that means is it still leaves totally unexplained this mystery as to why it is that Trump was so, as I say, enamored, kind of in this love affair that they keep talking about between him and Putin. What's the story here? And they're ignoring the underlying sin that was apparently being concealed by all of these people lying all the time, and Trump attempting to obstruct the investigation, to stop the investigation. What was it that they were so frightened about coming out? And so on Thursday, or on Tuesday rather, this last Tuesday on the 23rd, we focused on this issue about what in the world this underlying sin may well have been. And we reviewed just briefly the handful of candidates. We pointed out that the number one candidate of the fact that they were actually conspiring and colluding to have the election of Trump take place, and they were coordinating all of their activities together in a conspiracy to undermine the election process and thereby undermine the legitimacy of the election of Trump himself. But given the fact that that one had been more or less effectively taken off the table by Mueller himself, and then in the big rush of all the media people doing it, and then of course the regular Democrats buying that completely, and actually parroting it over and over again. Well, it was really good news. It was really good news to find out that our president wasn't actually colluding and conspiring with the Russians to win the election, despite all the evidence to support it. But it's really good news for us to be told that we had to come to that conclusion. And so that what we were pointing out is that one of the 5 different theories as to what the big sin was that they were afraid of being revealed that caused them to be lying and obstructing all the time, that one's off the table. And so we just quickly reviewed the other ones, and that was that Trump didn't actually think he was going to win. And so therefore he was using his campaign simply to build up goodwill with Russia. A lot of focus on this one is with the Trump Tower deal. A lot of talk about the Trump Tower deal Isn't it great that we dug down in so deeply and discovered that he was actually lying, that he was actually continuing to engage in the negotiation to build the Trump Tower all the way up until the convention, and then even after he was the nominee, they continued doing this all that time, and then were lying about it, like as if that was the big sin. Okay, that's one of the big candidates that's still left out on the table. The second of the remaining three was that there was this history of money laundering on the part of Trump, of him actually accepting loans from the Deutsche Bank into which the Russian oligarchs were depositing their embezzled money in Russia. And then that bank, under the whip hand of the oligarchs in Russia, was extending loans to Trump when nobody else would do that. And so they would loan him the money, and then he would build this big, gigantic Trump Tower, and that money was being laundered because the money was being loaned by the bank, but when the money was paid back by Trump to the bank, it was clean money in the bank, in the Deutsche Bank, for the oligarchs. And in addition to that, we pointed out that there was evidence that Trump, after he would build one of these great big towers with all the condominiums, would sell the condominiums to the oligarchs. And each of them would buy 6 or 8 of these different condominiums for, say, $6 million, and then turn around and sell it for $5 million, and then have $5 million of clean money. And that Trump was involved in doing that with them. And so that was purportedly the underlying sin, that he was afraid of being revealed, and that explained why he was in fact disposed so favorably toward the Russians, because the oligarchs are all pals of Putin. They're all involved together in embezzling billions of dollars in Russia and becoming super wealthy, and that Trump was part of that little gang, and that they were afraid of that becoming exposed, and that was the sin that people are sniffing around about, even though the hordes of all the media and the regular Democratic Party and even the progressives in the Democratic Party have all been taken off the scent of that trip, and they're into looking only at the obstruction. And then there's the last one, the one that people titter about all the time, and I think he actually even caused a couple of people to walk out here when I just mentioned it last time, is the famous pee videos. And I won't go into it anymore. I don't want to lose any more of you. But then there's that one, and that they have these sex tapes on Trump, and that he would be humiliated, if they were made public. That's hard to believe in light of how humiliating things are he does every day, and she still stays with him, and so that we, however, on Tuesday, proffered another explanation. By the time we got to the end of the discussion last time, we proffered this thing that nobody seems to be talking about. And that is the fact that on April 27th of 2016, now this is April, May, June, July, August, September, October, like 7 months before the election, when Trump's first foreign policy speech was scheduled to take place at the National Press Club. 2 days before that, on the 25th of April, Manafort suddenly changed the venue of that speech from the National Press Club in Washington over to the Mayflower Hotel. And that the Mayflower Hotel was rented by the Center for the National Interest. And that the Center for the National Interest turns out to be this interesting group that was actually founded originally by Richard Nixon, the honorary president of which is Henry Kissinger, on the board of directors of which is Jeff Sessions. And this is viewed as one of the most pro-Russian think tanks in all of Washington. And this speech that he gives there is basically a laudation of Russia and Putin, and how we have to really have better relations with them. And there's no reason for us to be at odds with Russia now that the Cold War is over. But what isn't talked about, even though that was an issue that came up for the special prosecutor, only because at the cocktail party before that speech, at the Mayflower Hotel, there was an exclusive cocktail party. And I hadn't even done all the research on this as of just last Tuesday, when I kept referring to this being limited to 240 people. It turns out it was limited to 24 people. There were only 24 people in that VIP special cocktail before his speech. And in it was the Russian ambassador, the ambassador from Italy, the ambassador from Singapore, and a whole bunch of these special officials that we'll end up taking a look at as we go on in this thing. But it turns out that all of them were involved in the undertaking of the selling of the former Russian government-owned oil corporation. This particular company, it's got a kind of a strange name, Rosenfeld, was actually up for sale, and they were selling shares in it. And the people that were at that meeting, virtually all of them ended up being people that were involved in that purchase. And it turns out that this is the purchase of the combined Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and the northern Arctic shelf that's within the economic zone of Russia. And it turns out that it's projected that there are some 87 billion barrels of oil underneath that northern Arctic shelf. And that the sale is going to be, the front sale is going to be for $11 billion for each 20% interest in it. And there were going to be 5 partners that were going to come into this deal, and that they were anticipating that the amount of oil that's going to be taken out of there, if in fact global climate change can be continued, and that it continues to melt the ice caps in the ice fields up there so they can get at all of that oil, that they're anticipating that it is worth $10 trillion. It has some 30% of the world's natural gas up there, and it's got 13 to 15% of all of the oil on the entire planet, or under the entire planet. Yes?
Do you know who those 5 partners were?
Yes, that's what's interesting here. It turns out that one of them is ExxonMobil, and that is why Rex Tillerson was actually given the award of the Friendship with Russia Award, the highest award given by Russia to any foreigners. He was given that, and that is why he was made the Secretary of State by Trump. And in fact, the other partner was Qatar, the nation of Qatar, which their national airlines have offices in Trump Tower. And another 20% was going filtered back into Russia, actually. Even though they were selling it, they were ending up buying back some 20% of their own shares through this extraordinary loan that was being extended to them by the Italian bank, therefore the ambassador from Italy being there in that meeting. And it turns out that that money had been loaned to the Italian bank by the Russian central bank, and that they're buying back their own stock. And then very interestingly, there's another 20% secret partner in this deal. And it's a group that is registered in the Cayman Islands. And we've investigated this some since last Tuesday. And what we have discovered is that, that very importantly, that also in this meeting, among the 24 chosen people, was this fellow, Bud McFarlane. And Bud McFarlane, as I mentioned to you, was one of the people that was charged in the Iran-Contra scandal by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, and he was indicted for withholding information, for concealing information. And as I get into our discussion today, I will point out is that these major scandals that break out into the public that seem to be going on between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, that become framed as a constitutional crisis, like the Watergate burglary and like the Iran-Contra scandal. And now this one is that they all consistently conceal what the underlying deeper sin is that's being concealed, and what all the obstruction is about, and all the lying is about. And it happens over and over again. And that's what I want to talk about with us here today. Because as it turns out, that this group, that are the secret Cayman Island group, it turns out I've investigated this since last Tuesday, and I've discovered that the group is actually had the name. It's first thing we discovered, that it was represented by the Walker Law Firm. The Walker Law Firm, which turns out to be associated with a man by the name of Stephen Schwartzman, who is one of Trump's economic advisors. And he was the co-founder of the Blackstone Sovereign Wealth Fund. And his co-founder was a guy named Pete Peterson, who's on the board of directors of the Center for the National Interest, which is the sponsor of that particular VIP gathering that they had there. And Jeff Sessions is on that board as well.
Two questions. Who's economic advisor for Trump again?
The fellow's name is Stephen Schwartzman, Schwartzman.
And then the second one is what?
Pete Peterson. He is the co-founder with Schwartzman of the Blackstone Sovereign Wealth Fund. Okay.
What do you think, like, the motivation behind the sale of this incredibly valuable resource?
Well, usually the sale of these former Russian-owned companies is all what is engineering the massive wealth of the oligarchs. That's what's happening. And so that all these oligarchs that Putin is part of, and that Trump is friends with and getting loans from indirectly through the Deutsche Bank, are all hogging out at the sale of these Russian-owned companies. The mining companies and the water companies and the construction companies, all of them that used to be owned collectively by Russia, were being privatized. And this is the big daddy. One of the oil corporation, the big Russian oil corporation, is this one. And that they had a name for the group. All we know is that the Walker Law Firm represented them in the Caymans. We've dug that out so far. And the name that the group was using, the front that they were using, is called the Intertrust Group. The Intertrust Group was the other partner for a 20% interest. And we tracked them, and it turns out they've changed their name just recently, just like Blackwater International has done. When they got in trouble, they just keep changing their name. They've changed their name now to the QHG Holdings, which is based in Singapore. Therefore, the ambassador from Singapore being there in the meeting. Okay? And so the question that we have posed to us, who are the principals? Who are the secret fiduciaries in this secret group that's ending up getting 20% of what is ultimately a potential $10 trillion in oil and gas up on the northern Arctic shelf? And what should we think about the fact that in order for those resources to be fully developed, it's going to require global climate change to continue and to not be stopped or turned back, and that it might even be increased. Therefore, the doubling and tripling of the oil output in North America under Trump, ordering the Dakota Access Pipeline to go forward despite the fact that they're not complying with the Environmental Protection Act requirements. And of course, then he appoints to head up the Environmental Protection Division, he appoints Scott Pruitt, who is the Attorney General from Oklahoma, the home of the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation. The Kerr of which I pointed out to you was Robert S. Kerr, the governor, four-time governor and four-time senator from Oklahoma, who chaired the United States Senate Armed Services Committee. Okay? And so I highlighted for you that Bud McFarlane was at this April 27th VIP cocktail for 24 people, and that Bud McFarlane wrote an article soon thereafter that was published in The National Interest, which is the magazine for the Center for the National Interest. And in the National Interest magazine, he published an article in which he said, Russia will be becoming the integral partner of the United States in ensuring the energy security of the Western world. And that's what this is all about. What's going on here is that not only are these oligarchs and these partners in this sale, this privatization of the national oil company of Russia, not only are they becoming filthy rich, but what's happening is what Trump and Putin are engaged in is establishing an alliance between Russia and the United States to control virtually all of the oil in the world. Because the United States has invaded and occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields and is continuing to do so. So they have control of those oil fields. They are engaging in this rapid build-out of the oil drilling and stuff in the United States, with Trump not only ordering the going forward of the Dakota Access Pipeline in violation of the the environmental protection laws, but also ordering the going forward of the Keystone XL pipeline. All of them in defiance of the environmental laws, and has issued the orders opening up all the national parks to further oil drilling and natural gas exploration and coal mining. All right? And he's also now opened up all the Indian reservations, ergo the Dakota Access Pipeline, going right next door to the Indian reservation up there. Okay, and the other one, the Keystone XL pipeline, is coming right next door to the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. So you got the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation and the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation being the major target areas for building out these pipelines in violation of the Environmental Protection Act. And you got Scott Pruitt from Oklahoma put in place to set aside all of the EPA standards. And now you've got Barr in there as the Attorney General, allowing them all to get away with it. Okay? So this isn't rocket science that we're talking about here. What it requires is actually looking. You have to look in order to find it. Okay? And the reason that I know enough to look is because we've had to look in the past. Dealing with the Watergate burglary, dealing with the Iran-Contra scandal, both of which I'm going to talk about here today, because the underlying sin of these constitutional crises are consistently concealed from the American people. But there is this conflict going on between the Republican Party, that is the Hamiltonian financiers and the entrepreneurs and the mercantile class, going on against the Madisonians and the Jeffersonians, who are in fact more into simple agriculture and local control and individual regional rights, etc., over and against a more powerful centralized federal government, in that case, nowadays, the global government. The whole thing of globalization, the whole building out of this globalization operation that's going on now on the world level. And that's what's happening right now. And so that those questions are posed in front of us right now is, who are the actual principals or fiduciaries of this intertrust group, or QHG Holdings? And what we have found out is that the QHG Holdings was in fact put together by a group called Glencore Energy in the United Kingdom, along with a group from Qatar. But both of them have been identified as functioning as front operations for secret groups, so that they would logically be the ones that would do the fronting for them, but it still doesn't answer who the fiduciaries are. And so if, in fact, the fiduciaries include Donald Trump and Putin, they are dead men walking. Okay? And if it can be shown that they are engaged in this conspiracy together to not only become multi-billionaires over the control of this oil, but that they're actually being benefited by the continuation of global climate change in order to continue to melt down those ice fields up there so they can get at this $10 trillion worth of oil. Okay? So there you have a major candidate in front of us right now as the ultimate sin that is being concealed by this. And what I want to point out to you today is that this is what happens when you see these kinds of crises come forward, where the Republican and Democratic Party go at each other, and it gives rise to this major confrontation where, in most instances, the representative of the Republican Party in the executive branch, whether it's Richard Nixon and the Republican Party concealing the Watergate burglary, or whether or not it is the Republicans under the Nixon and Bush administrations concealing the off-the-shelf enterprise in the Iran-Contra scandal, or this one that's happening now. And what I want to do in order to bolster the potential credibility of the thesis that we're looking at here, that we may have targeted what the underlying sin is in this scandal, which no one else is talking about. I'll tell you why it is that we at the Romero Institute, which was originally the Christic Institute that investigated a lot of these other crimes, came to know about. And what I'm going to be doing is that in the following couple weeks, I'm going to be connecting this very directly to the global climate change that's going on and the indigenous peoples' uprisings against these pipelines, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL Pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that it's not coincidental that it is the indigenous people that are being targeted for these pipelines, and they're being demonized by Tiger Swan, private military corporation that's being hired by the oil corporations to come in and lay down this major investigative neutralizing activity against the indigenous people. And it's going to lead us all the way back to Steve Bannon, who was and continues to be one of the principal advisors for Donald Trump, contrary to the myth that somehow he's been ousted and they don't have any relations at all anymore. The fact of the matter is that Steve Bannon has developed this major thesis that we're going to be talking about in this class, where he believes that, in fact, the major opponents to the establishment of world domination, to the full spectrum dominance on the part of the elite white Caucasian members of the new Northern Industrial Alliance, the fundamental opponents are the indigenous Aboriginal people, whom he refers to as anti-Christian, anti-capitalist, religiously driven, indigenous terrorists. Okay? And that's his whole thesis that he has been espousing all of this time. Okay? And so what I want to do here today is I want to, in order to begin to get you to understand what it looks like to be actual participants in your next papers, since you've already gotten these in, and you're getting ready to do your paper now focusing on the impeachment part of this thing. I want you to start understanding that I want you to be participating in this investigation that we're engaged in here so that you can become part of history. And I want you to get used to doing this. I want you to understand that even at this level in your undergraduate career, you can become participants as scholars, as researchers, as writers in history. And that's what I'm trying to persuade you into doing. So I want to, in order to show you what it looks like, I'm going to give you the examples of the Watergate burglary and the Iran-Contra scandal, both of which I happen to have been directly, personally involved in. So we have access to direct inside information about what was really going on in those investigations, so that you can see that it's perfectly understandable that you can become involved with us in doing this investigation to attempt to uncover the underlying sin at the root of this particular scandal that's going on. And hopefully we can together participate in persuading the progressives to not stay trapped on just the obstruction charges, but to actually take a look at the collusion charges and come to understand what the underlying criminal activity was that's being concealed here. Because that is how he can not only get impeached by the House, but could get convicted by the Senate. Because once people understand what it is that they may well be up to in this whole thing, even his ardent supporters are going to fall away. Okay, and that's what you have to do in order to get them convicted. So let me turn now to this issue of the other major conspiracies that you've heard about, both of which reside mainly in your prehistory, because most of you weren't old enough at the time of either one of these two major conspiracies to have been sitting there watching it unfold and be actively involved in being deceived as to what was really happening here. But what you've done is you've heard about it. I mean, I could ask almost any one of you to give me a little thumbnail on the Watergate burglary, and you could probably do it. You could even probably tell me in general terms what you think happened in the Iran-Contra scandal. I don't want to embarrass any of you, but I would suggest that you get ready for that, because I'm going to be asking you about it later. But I'll give you some crib notes here on it. Now, that you remember that all of these big conspiracies, they all refer back to Watergate. They call it Watergate, Spygate, Iran-gate. They all grab on to the last end of the Watergate burglary as the nomenclature now for these types of vast conspiracies that are going on. And so Watergate is in fact the granddaddy of all of them. And what the public perception of what it is that happened in Watergate, which I'll lay out for you in just a couple minutes. I'll lay it right out. And then what I'm going to do is explain to you how deceptive that was of the vast majority of the American people. What happened is on June 17th of 1972, some 5 months before the election, the re-election bid of Richard Nixon. He'd been elected in 1968, so you're all the way into the fourth year of his term in 1972. There's getting set to be his re-election election in November of 1972. 5 months before the election, these 5 men are caught inside the Democratic National Headquarters. Not at all unlike being caught inside the Democratic National Headquarters computers now, of what happened here. The whole invasion of their computers and downloading their computers and finding out what they're doing, okay? But there was a break-in in the Democratic National Committee headquarters on the night of June 17th, and that while the 5 men were in there burglarizing the place, they put a tape on the entrance door into the back door of the Watergate Hotel. And the night watchman came by and found the tape holding the door unlocked. The door had been unlocked, and they taped closed the latch so that it would stay open. And, not being an A-caliber night watchman, he just took off the tape and closed the door and locked it. And he went around and he did his rounds, and he came back a while later and he checked the door again, and the tape was back on the door. And so he calls the police, okay? The police radio to Karl Schlaffer. Karl Schlaffer ended up being the head of the District of Columbia Organized Crime Strike Force and got to be a good friend of ours. In fact, is the guy that ended up tipping us that they were wiretapping our telephones at the Christic Institute during the Iran-Contra investigation. But anyway, I got to know him through this, and that he was out on an assignment with 5 of his other guys, and they were all doing a stakeout. All dressed up in hanging out clothes. And so they all rushed over to the Watergate Hotel, came rushing in, and caught the guys right there in the act. And they caught them with all the wiretapping equipment and the cameras for photographing documents, et cetera, and they brought them in and arrested them. Okay, they were arraigned in the D.C. Superior Court, and a young reporter, brand new reporter at the Washington Post by the name of Bob Woodward, gets a call that these people have been arrested and they're being arraigned. He gets up and jumps into his clothes and runs over to the Superior Court, goes into the courtroom, and they're all being arraigned. And when they're asked for their names and their occupations, one of them says that his occupation is freedom fighter. And one of the other ones mumbles that he works for the Central Intelligence Agency. And everybody goes, what? What? Yeah, I work for the Central Intelligence Agency. And so he goes after him. Bob Woodward goes over and finds out that he is saying he worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. And so he rushes back to the Washington Post, and he goes in to see Ben Bradley and tells him about this. And they start looking into what the connection here might be. And what they discover is that these people all have associations with the Central Intelligence Agency. James McCord was a CIA wiretapping specialist. Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Rolando Martinez, and Frank Sturgis, all of whom were caught in the hotel, all are associated with the Central Intelligence Agency. And then they actually find a key on one of them to a hotel room nearby. They go to it. The hotel room is registered to E. Howard Hunt, who is also a Central Intelligence Agency guy. And so they go and arrest him too. So they're all arrested, and they find in the pocket, inside the sports jacket pocket of Bernard Barker, a check in his pocket, written out to him. And the money is traced back to the Committee to Re-elect the President. They call it the CREEP. And so they found the thing in his pocket. And so Woodward and Bernstein now, Carl Bernstein, who's working on the thing with him, and Ben Bradley start jumping up and down ecstatically, saying, look, we caught them. Here they are, being with a check in their pocket from the Committee to Re-elect the President, burglarizing the Democratic National Committee headquarters. This is trouble for them. And so they go after them, and they keep pushing and pushing. And the president, just exactly like Donald Trump, just keeps saying, this is crazy, this is insulting, this is stupid. You know, I didn't have anything to do with this. I don't know anything about what they're talking about. You're wasting everybody's time. You're distracting everybody. And he goes on that way all the way up until the election. And he wins the election in one of the biggest landslides in history, and beating George McGovern. It comes back into his second term in the presidency, and the Washington Post continues going after him. And they dig out the information that, in fact, these people that were working for E. Howard Hunt, turns out E. Howard Hunt was employed at the White House. And he was working in the White House for Jeb Magruder, one of the White House staff people. And they start going after it, and they get to Jeb Magruder, and they find out there was this big bag of cash that was kept in the safe in the White House, where they actually paid these guys from. And that there was a whole bunch of other things that they were doing. That they went out and, for example, burglarized the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg, who had turned over the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times that I happened to be the legal counsel for. That we represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case and got all of those published. And then Dan Ellsberg got arrested and charged with stealing the papers. And the other office represented him. Our office wouldn't represent him. I was shocked. I thought we were going to represent him, and I went up to see Larry McKay, our senior partner, and he said, it's one thing to represent the New York Times for $1 million fee. It's another thing to represent a traitor, he said. And so I took all the files that I had and that I'd done all the work on, and I'd prepared all the defenses for Punch Sulzberger and whoever the source was, and for Neil Sheehan, and I brought them over and gave them to Leonard Bodine in Rabinowitz Bodine Standard. We're going to be the defendants, or the defense counsel for him, and so they did. And so I was asked to leave the firm. And they said that apparently my interests were not the same as their clients, which I couldn't disagree with them about. But anyway, the bottom line is that so the big scandal breaks like that, and they go, "Oh, good, we caught him doing it." And then it turns out, as you've all heard about, it turns out that Alexander Butterfield revealed to what was his name, the fellow from the National Security Archives. Anyway, that there was actually tape recorders going inside the White House Oval Office, and so there were tape recordings of everything that happened in the office. And the special prosecutor ended up getting appointed, Leon Jaworski. It was originally not Jaworski. He replaced the other one that came in that started the investigation. Who was it? The guy from Archibald Cox was actually the original special prosecutor, was in and started going after the tapes, and they fired him. And they had to work their way through 2 or 3 different people because they wouldn't fire him. They ordered the Attorney General to fire him, and he wouldn't do it, and so he resigned. And then they ordered the Assistant U.S. Attorney General to do it. He wouldn't do it, so he resigned. And they finally got down to Robert Bork, who agreed to fire the special prosecutor, for which he was dutifully rewarded with appointment to the federal bench, and eventually was nominated to the United States Supreme Court for playing as part of the team. But the bottom line is that once they got their hands on the tape recordings, they actually got a tape recording from June 23rd. The burglary took place on June 17th of 1972. They got a tape recording of the June 23rd conversation that went on between that wasn't John Ehrlichman, it was Bob Haldeman. Bob Haldeman, who was the chief of staff for Nixon, and Nixon having this private conversation in the Oval Office, where, as the statement goes, Nixon instructed Haldeman to go over to the Central Intelligence Agency and talk to Dick Helms and Vernon Walters, the CIA director and the deputy director, and get them to call the FBI, to call Pat Gray at the FBI, the new head of the FBI, and instruct them to get out of this investigation right now. And when that tape was discovered, it was deemed to be obstruction of justice. And therefore, he was impeached. They passed articles of impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee, and before they could come for a vote up on the floor of the House, Nixon resigned, asserting that he realized he had lost his capacity to govern, is how he put it. Okay? And that's the story of the Watergate burglary. And isn't that great? Aren't we terrific? Not only did the Justice Department act in an honorable way in going after him, but the Fifth Estate of the Washington Post was diligent and worked away and got a hold of the information, and the nation was saved from this nasty dude, Richard Nixon. Okay, that's the public story. Okay, what they don't tell you is, what the hell were they doing in the Democratic National Headquarters? Why would they break into the Democratic National Headquarters and wiretap their telephones? What were they after that would cause them to take such a great risk? And so people kept asking that question. Well, why were they in the Watergate Hotel? Well, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference because they were obstructing and they were lying about it. And Richard Nixon was actually instructing the Central Intelligence Agency to get the FBI to step out of the investigation of this. Okay, and that's obstruction of justice, and that's all you need to know. So you don't really need to know why they were in there. But if you did know why they were in there, you would come to understand what we're talking about here today. And it turns out that, I want to see pencils moving on this one, what it turns out is that Richard Nixon himself personally instructed Jeb Magruder and his White House staff to get these particular people to go into the Watergate Hotel and wiretap the telephone of Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien was the head of the Democratic National Committee. but he'd only been recently appointed to be the new head of the Democratic National Committee, because prior to that time, for some 20 years, he had been the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes. And it turns out that Howard Hughes is the man who Richard Nixon, back when he was the vice president of the United States under Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1952 to 1960, that in June of 1960, when Richard Nixon, as the vice president, was campaigning for the Republican Party nomination for the presidency, as soon as Nelson Rockefeller dropped out of the primary race in Michigan, Nixon knew that he was going to be the nominee, and so he goes to the telephone, a secret telephone they have that was a scrambled telephone that he had that was going directly to Howard Hughes. Because it turns out Howard Hughes, you may not know who he is, but that he was this big famous guy that was this creative inventor. He invented what they call the spruce goose. It was this big gigantic plane that he invented to show that he could fly this thing. And it became the prototype for the C-5A cargo plane for all of the United States military transports and stuff. And he became very famous, but he became a recluse and nobody knew what he was doing. Well, it turns out what he was doing is he was being a secret consultant to the National Security Council. And he created this company called the Summa Corporation. He invented a thing called the Glomar Explorer, which is this major ship that could reach down and lift up submarines off the bottom of the ocean. And they were going around in case there was any kind of a crashed Russian submarine. They could find it and pull it up from the bottom and get out all their codes and all their machines and all their radar and stuff. And he was doing that and a couple other programs which you don't need to know about, but which we happen to know about. But he was deeply involved in doing all of that. And so Richard Nixon, as soon as he knew that he was going to be the nominee, and he was convinced that he was going to win the presidency. I mean, after all, he'd been a congressman, he'd been a United States senator from California. He, in fact, had been the vice president of the United States under Eisenhower. He had chaired the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council, in charge of all covert operations. He was the big domo in the Republican Party. And the Democrats were going to nominate this young punk, John Kennedy, whose father had bought him his seat, basically, in the House and then the Senate. In that it was just sort of a vanity piece that he was running for the presidency, and everybody expected that Nixon was going to win. So what Nixon did is, in the telephone call, he asked Howard Hughes to set up a political assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro, the new head of the revolutionary government in Cuba that had thrown out Batista back in January of 1959. And this is only in 1960 now, in June of 1960. It was like 6 months earlier. And Richard Nixon, in his capacity as the head of the National Security Council's 5412 Committee, had insisted to Fidel Castro that they not have any diplomatic relations with either Russia or China if they were going to get any type of assistance from the United States. And Fidel Castro said, no, we're going to have relations with all the countries of the world, and we're not going to have you dictate to us. And so Richard Nixon began a covert operation against the island of Cuba that was called Operation 40. And in January of 1959, when the Cuban Revolution succeeded and threw out Batista, this rampant criminal, and threw him out, all his right-wing cronies in Cuba fled from Cuba, and they came up to Miami and Tampa and set up camp up there, including Santo Trafficante, who was the mob boss, the mafia boss of Havana, who happened to be the client of F. Lee Bailey in our office, and who explained to us all of this directly, because he was the one that Howard Hughes ended up going to through his lawyer, Bob Mayhew, and then to Johnny Roselli. It's a long story. But anyway, they got Trafficante to agree to set up this political assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the other 5 commandantes of the new Russian revolutionary government, the Cuban revolutionary government. And so that, you might stop right there and saying, whoa, okay, I can see why Nixon was afraid that maybe Larry O'Brien, having been the lobbyist for Howard Hughes for 20 years in Washington, might have found out about this deep secret, that it was Howard Hughes that set up the assassination team to actually try to kill Castro. And if that were revealed, that might disrupt his chances for being elected. But that's not the whole story. The whole story is that that's the team that assassinated President Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd of 1963, with details given to us directly by Santos Trafficante, who set up the team. And he knew the people who ran the team, the people that were in charge of the team, and what happened. Okay? And that's what Richard Nixon was terrified about coming out. Because if it came out, even with months left to the election, nobody was going to believe that he didn't know the team that he set up killed President Kennedy, whom everybody knows he hated, because Kennedy beat him in the election back in 1960 by, in fact, confronting him in their second debate and charging Richard Nixon with being soft on communism. And said that here's this new government down in Cuba, just 90 miles from our shore, and you're not doing anything to get rid of them. And Kennedy knew full well that there was a full-scale covert operation going on under Nixon's command to get rid of the government down there. But he couldn't say anything about it. And John Kennedy confronted him with it live on their debate and shamed him right in front of the world and then beat him in the election. And so everybody knew that he hated him. So nobody's going to believe that he didn't know that the team that he set up through Howard Hughes to kill Castro had been the ones that killed the president. And that's the story that nobody wanted told. Nobody wanted that story told, including the Democrats. And that's why Lyndon Johnson, following the assassination of President Kennedy, set up the Warren Commission under Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he went to Earl Warren and said, I need to have you head up this commission to give it credibility. And Earl Warren said no, he thought that was totally inappropriate to involve the Supreme Court in something like that. And then Lyndon Johnson said to him, look, you've got to do this, because as it turns out, he said, John Kennedy set up a team to assassinate Castro. And if in fact that ever gets out, everybody's going to believe that Castro must have found out that Kennedy, Bobby, and John set up the team to assassinate him, and therefore they retaliated against him. And so you've got to keep secret. You've got to make sure you sit on this commission and keep it from being revealed that this assassination team ever existed. And that was from the Democratic Party, was keeping that silent. And so they joined together in this agreement that that information was to be kept secret. No one was to talk about this. At which point the Democrats, of course, won and were planning to win again, except for the fact that when Lyndon Johnson was getting ready to run on his own to be reelected, he became president in 1963 when John was killed in November. He ran for re-election in 1964, and he got elected directly. And he was getting ready to run for re-election in 1968. But in fact, he almost lost the primary to McCarthy, Gene McCarthy, who was brought in to run against him. And then Bobby Kennedy came into the race. And everybody suspected that Bobby Kennedy, if he was elected president, was going to go digging on this, was going to have the FBI and the Justice Department and the others conduct a full-scale investigation, and he was going to be president of the United States, capable of getting the Central Intelligence Agency to have to reveal what it is that happened here, okay? And then Bobby gets shot and killed. And Hubert Humphrey comes in to take his place and loses the election to Nixon in 1968 by less than 1%. And so Richard Nixon comes to power. And Richard Nixon stays in power. He is elected by 1% of the vote against Humphrey, is in office for 4 years. And then it comes back to 1972, and what he does is, in order to, this is more information, that when he's running, not only is he running this burglary team to go into the Democratic National Headquarters and find out if Lawrence O'Brien knows about the secret, but he is also reaching out to the North Vietnamese secretly and getting them to agree not to enter into a peace settlement with Lyndon Johnson. Because if Lyndon Johnson were to actually achieve a peace treaty with North Vietnam and end the Vietnam War, then Lyndon Johnson would win the re-election in 1968. So Richard Nixon, through Chenault, Chenault's wife, reaches out to the North Vietnamese and gets a deal made with them, that they, in fact, will not enter into an agreement with Lyndon Johnson. That way it will weaken him, so Richard Nixon can win. Again, and everybody in Washington knows that. Everybody knows he did that. Okay? But they didn't impeach him for that. They didn't impeach him for that at all. And so here now you have the charges being made against Trump that he was reaching out and having these secret communications with the Russians about relieving the sanctions against them, and everybody's pretending like that ought to cause him to be impeached. But they all knew Richard Nixon had done that to the North Vietnamese. And not only that, they know that George Bush Sr., when he was running as vice president with Reagan in 1980, reached out to the Hezbollah and got them to agree to hold our 52 American hostages and not enter into a deal with then President Jimmy Carter, so Jimmy Carter would lose. So this goes on all the time. And so here it is now, everybody getting really indignant about Donald Trump, about having done stuff that they know not only that Richard Nixon did in reaching out to the North Vietnamese so he could win, and that George Bush Sr., working in the Reagan-Bush campaign, reached out to them. Not only that, but George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., in 1980, not only reached out to the Hezbollah and got that agreement to have them hold our hostages until after the election, they funneled money in through his director of covert operations when he was the director of the CIA from 1974 to 1977, this guy Theodore Shackley. They reached out and brought money in from the Nugan Hand Bank down in Australia that was money skimmed off the heroin trafficking in Southeast Asia in a deal that was set up between Theodore Shackley as the CIA station chief in Saigon, along with Vang Pao, who was one of the 3 opium warlords in Cambodia. That money was in the Nugan Hand Bank, and they brought it into the elections in 1980. They brought it into the elections, and they put it through 2 South African banks and brought it into the United States and put millions of dollars into the campaign against Frank Church up in Idaho for his reelection in 1980, because he was the chair of the Church Committee that was set up after the Watergate Committee. And so people say, why did that happen? Why did they set up the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to investigate intelligence abuses by the Central Intelligence Agency? Why did they do that right after the Watergate burglary? And nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about it. But it was because they knew that the Central Intelligence Agency had been involved in burglarizing the hotel. They knew that the CIA had been involved in knowing about the assassination of the president. They knew the CIA had been involved in the covert operations against Cuba. They knew all of that. And so what the Democrats did after Nixon resigned is they set up the Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse. And they decided how much they were going to allow to come out about that so they could seal that off. They could stop all the further investigations of that. And it was Frank Church from Idaho, the Democratic senator from Idaho, who was the chair of that committee. And in 1980, the CIA, Theodore Shackley, covert operations director under George Bush Sr., brought that money in from the Nugan Bank through South Africa into the United States and defeated Frank Church up in Idaho by putting in millions of dollars of campaigns and public ads about how Frank Church supported the Equal Rights Amendment and how he supported a restriction on gun owners. Those were the two main things, and just poured the money in, just exactly like Russia is being accused of doing now, coming in and dealing with them in what the actual fissures were in the political community and exacerbating them, just like that. And they did the same thing. They did the same thing to Dick, what's his head from Iowa, Clark, from Dick Clark in Iowa, who was another United States senator who had in fact opposed covert Central Intelligence Agency operations in Africa. And they did the same thing to Birch Bayh in Indiana, who had opposed the Central Intelligence Agency. And so there were 3 of the United States senators that they targeted, and they went into their states, and they did intelligence gathering on what the CIA did intelligence gathering on what the political fissures were in those communities, and they exacerbated them by millions of dollars of ads, and then got those guys defeated. Okay? And everybody in Washington, D.C. knows that. And they still don't ever let you know that. So there's this whole thing that goes on inside the Beltway of the secrets that are known. And when I came in to Washington in 1975 at the Jesuit headquarters, I didn't know all about that stuff yet, but I knew a lot because I'd been already on the Watergate burglary case in F. Lee Bailey's office. I'd already been representing the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, so I got to see all 47 volumes of the top secret classified cable traffic and everything having to do with the Vietnam War that revealed the existence of the political assassination team, the opium smuggling, all of that stuff. Okay? So I knew a good deal, and that was, of course, why I, in a certain sense, qualified to be the legal counsel for the Jesuits. That you're up on a sophisticated level of knowing what's really going on in the world, and that so you can play on that type of a field. Okay? So that's what really happened in the Watergate case. And that, the knowledge of it, even among the so-called well-informed, was just what I told you in the first 2 minutes. Oh, they discovered the check in the pocket of Bernard Barker, and they traced the money to Creep, and therefore it was the president and his committee paying to burglarize the Democratic National Committee. But what they don't tell you is that the check that was in his pocket, the money came from the committee to re-elect the president, but it had been filtered through a bank, the Banco Internacional in Mexico City. And it was put into a particular account down there, a lawyer by the name of Ogario. And that's where the check was drawn from that account. And the deputy director of the FBI was actually going that day, on the 24th of June, the next day, was planning to go down to Mexico City to find out about that account and what that was all about. And it turns out that that bank account is where they put the money to run the political assassination team that was put together by Nixon to kill Castro. They used the exact same account to put the money in to pay the burglars to go in, and because they picked the burglars who already knew what they were looking for. Because it turns out those people were part of the assassination team. Those people that were in the Watergate Hotel were all part of the assassination team, the S-Force, that killed the president.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so who's on this team?
There are 15 men on the team, and they were all handpicked by Santos Trafficante, and they were all people who had been his gunmen down in Havana when he was there before Batista was overthrown. And all of them had been recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency after they came up to Miami and Tampa to be part of Operation 40. So they were all part of these guerrilla bands. They were in 5 of these paramilitary camps that were located down through the southeastern United States, one on Swan Island, one on No Name Key, one in the Everglades, and one on each end, the north and south end of Lake Pontchartrain. And the person that was in charge of the one on Swan Island was Frank Sturgis, the very guy that was involved in the Watergate burglary. And the other guy who was in charge of the paramilitary base for the anti-Castro Cubans in the Everglades was E. Howard Hunt. And that's the guy they're talking about on the smoking gun tape. The smoking gun tape on June 23rd, that how many people here, I'll show you, how many people here have ever listened to that tape? Okay? And what they're talking about on the tape, what Nixon is talking about, is you can't, they're investigating, he said the assistant director of the FBI is getting ready to go down to investigate that bank in Mexico. That's what you can't allow to happen. That you've got to stop. So I want you, Bob, to go over and get John Ehrlichman. I want you to go over to the agency, and I want you to get Dick Helms and Vernon Walters to contact Pat Gray over at the FBI and tell them to get the hell out of this investigation right now. Because this Hunt guy, if you peel that scab back, there's going to be a hell of a lot in there that we don't want talked about. Okay? That's the assassination stuff. And in fact, in the Watergate burglary hearings, Sam Ervin, the North Carolina senator that was chairing those particular hearings, he asked Bob Haldeman live on national television when they played part of that tape, when he said, that you can't let them go into that part of the investigation, with that Hunt guy, you peel off that scab and there's a hell of a lot in there that we don't want talked about. What were they talking about, he said. And Bob Haldeman said, I think they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. And there was this dead silence fell over the entire room for like 30 seconds. And then they all shuffled and looked at their notes and went on to the next questions. Something completely different. Okay? So it almost happened. It almost happened right there. Okay? So and those are the things that you don't know about. This is the part of the deep history that I want you to start appreciating here. You might not have expected it in a class here at this particular university about this general subject of the impeachment, but now you know. And so you're among the people that know, and therefore you should start getting used to it. And you should feel perfectly comfortable about going after deeper information than you're told by the regular news media or by any of the authorities, because you need to know what's really going on in order to know how deep to dig on the next thing that happens, and not to take their word for it, and not to be bluffed out by the news media, not to be bluffed out by the alliance between the Republican and Democratic Party that don't want you to know about a particular thing. Just don't be bluffed out by these people. Just keep going after it. So that's what happened in the Watergate burglary. And we were, of course, with regard to the Iran-Contra scandal, the other one that you hear talked about all the time is the analogy to what's happening right now. The short understanding of Iran-Contra is that, this young lieutenant colonel, Oliver North, who was a real go-getter, decided that he wanted to stop the Sandinistas, the left-wing communist insurrectionists down in Nicaragua, who rose up and overthrew Anastasio Somoza, a long and dear and trusted friend of the United States in protecting the good people of Nicaragua and Central America. That they rose up and overthrew him, and this young, ambitious, kind of forward-leaning young lieutenant colonel decided that he wanted to go around and recruit a bunch of old retired people sort of on the golf courses around Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and bring them in, people who'd been in the Central Intelligence Agency back hundreds of years ago, and people that have been in the Pentagon that were kind of weapons specialists, et cetera, and see if they couldn't put together some kind of an operation to try to unofficially help the poor regime of Anastasio Somoza, who'd been forced to go in the middle of the night and dig up his father and grandfather in their graves and to take them with him going into exile over in Uruguay. And that, it was such a sad story in that he had a number of his National Guard people go with him to be his security people, et cetera. And so that this young, ambitious lieutenant colonel decided that what he would do is try to figure out how to get some arms and assistance to them so that even though they'd been temporarily ousted, they could organize a group of people who represented the vast majority of the people in Central America who wanted to get rid of this communist infiltration of our domain. And he had done that. And he'd gone around recruiting them, and they had basically pasted and patched together some different people around the country who, in their own private capacity, would go forward, and that they would bring some, handguns and some hunting rifles and things down to these National Guard guys, and that help them get organized to try to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. But lo and behold, he got caught. He got caught primarily because when they were flying in a bunch of these arms on a C-123, it got shot down. And Sawyer and Cooper, who were the pilot and co-pilot, got killed. But there was this guy there with them by the name of Eugene Hassenfuss, who was the kicker. He was the guy that they would come by with a C-123. They'd open the back trap door, and he would kick out these big bundles of weapons that would be parachuted down to the Contras. And he got caught, and he ratted them out. And therefore, the roof fell in on them, and therefore, there was this big scandal. And, lo and behold, the Attorney General, poor innocent Ed Meese, was shocked to discover that this was going on. And so he'd rushed to the television cameras to let everybody know right away that there was going to be a major investigation here. But the only real issue was whether the president knew about this, and whether he had authorized this in writing to have been allowed to go on. Was there an agreement? Was there an agreement here? Because that's the test. If you're going to be the Attorney General and you're going to have a special prosecutor investigating, the test has to be whether there's an official agreement, a formal agreement. Otherwise, there's no crime here. And so he came on November 25th of 1986, and he asked to have a special prosecutor appointed by the special committee of the Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate all of this. And the heavily right-wing, Republican-dominated special counsel of the, or special committee of the Court of Appeals chose Lawrence Walsh, a long-respected conservative Republican federal judge who was the chief counsel for Crow-Dunn levy in Oklahoma, actually. Was the legal counsel for the Kerr-McGee Petroleum Corporation, in fact, who had been defeated by us at the Christie Institute and rolled into the swamp for $10.5 million for the killing of Karen Silkwood and the contaminating of her home. And so they just decided out of the blue of all the different people in the country that they would appoint him to be the special prosecutor. Because as it turned out, the only reason that Ed Meese came before the television cameras and confessed that there was this operation is because we had already exposed them. And we had filed a major federal lawsuit in the Southern District of Florida charging all of them by name with what they were doing. And the federal judge down there, James Lawrence King, had placed that complaint under seal. We filed the complaint actually on the 28th of May of 1986 on a Friday evening, and actually it was Thursday evening because we left one extra day in case there was some sort of a slip up. We filed it on Thursday at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Monday morning I get a call at 9 o'clock at my office in Washington, D.C., and it's James Lawrence King the chief federal judge of the Southern District of Florida. He says, Mr. Sheehan, this is Judge James Lawrence King. I'm the chief federal judge in the Southern District of Florida. I have your complaint in front of me here. I've decided, he said, to forego the normal procedure of putting it onto the wheel and getting just a normal random judge appointed for this. In light of the sensitivity of the charges you've made here, I've decided to take this case myself. And I just wanted to let you know that unless you're here in front of me in person by 2 o'clock this afternoon here in Miami, I'm going to enter a summary judgment against this complaint. Thank you, and hung up. And I went, whoa, wait a second. So fortunately, I had a suit in the closet in my office. So I run and jump into my suit. And I run down and get a cab, and we go out to National Airport, fly down to Miami. I come, get in the cab. We go driving from the airport over to the federal courthouse. I go running upstairs, and I come kind of hook sliding into his chambers, at about 5 minutes to 2, and he's not there. And it said, his secretary says, oh, he's out in the ceremonial courtroom. And so I go running out into the ceremonial courtroom, and here he is in full robes, sitting up on the bench, and there are 26 lawyers, all arrayed out in front of him. And he said, well, Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad to see that you made it here. We're up on the record here. I just invited you down because I wanted you to get to meet the lawyers that are going to be representing the defendants that you've named in your complaint. And he said, representing the head, who you claim to be the head of the FDN-Contras, Adolfo Calero, representing him is going to be Mr. Anthony Lapham, he said. And I said to myself, Anthony Lapham, how come I record? And I said, oh, right, Anthony Lapham was the chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George H.W. Bush, when he was the director of the CIA from 1974 to 1977. And here he is now representing Adolfo Calero, one of the chief defendants in our case. And Judge James Lawrence King said, yes, and now representing Mr. Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., who you've alleged in your complaint to be the owner of the Tamiami gun shop, whom you say is supplying the fake end-user certificates for all the weapons that are being smuggled, you said, down into Ilopango to the Contras. And he's being represented by Mr. Williams, who you may recognize his name as well, because he was, in fact, the head of the U.S. Attorney's criminal division here in Miami until last Friday at 5 o'clock. Who has decided now to retire and to go into private practice representing, he said, and I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think is the term you're looking for. And he said, that's it, Mr. Sheehan, okay. He said, look, I've heard about you. He said, and I'm not gonna have any of that in this case. I've called you down here and I'm letting you know you are under a gag order. I'm sealing this case. I'm going to keep the case completely sealed. And if you so much as breathe a single word about the mere existence of this lawsuit, nothing to do with the charges or any of the stuff in discovery, but even let them know it exists, I'm going to hold you in immediate, direct criminal contempt of court. And I'm going to put you in federal prison for 6 months. I said, oh, really? I said, that's curious. I said, I don't think you really have the authority to do that. And I just want to let you know, I don't have the slightest intention of abiding by it. And he said, well, I wanted to let you know. He said, you may not be familiar with the federal rules of civil procedure that we employ down here in the Southern District of Florida. I said, well, I assume they're the same as everywhere else in the country. I said, in fact, my professor of civil procedure at Harvard, Shapiro, wrote those rules. I happen to work on those rules with him. So I assume you're talking about the rule that authorizes a judge at his discretion to take reasonable steps to keep a jury when they're impaneled from being prejudiced by public information. I assume that's what you're talking about, but I don't think that gives you anywhere near the kind of latitude that you're taking here. And he just sort of stared at me and he said, well, we have a rule here that grants me discretion to take steps, reasonable steps, to keep a jury from being prejudiced. And he said, now, gentlemen, he talks to all the lawyers, I'm not saying here that this case is ever going to make it to a jury. He said, but I just wanted to let you know that I have the authority to restrict this, and if you breathe a word of this existence of this case, I'm going to put you in federal prison. I just thought you ought to know that. So I said, good. I said, I don't intend to abide by it. Are we all done here? And he said, yeah, we're all done. So I get up and walk out. I walk all the way back to go get a cab, and I fly back to Washington, D.C., and that was a Monday morning. So I come into my office Tuesday morning, and I get on the telephone, and I call up Russell Hemingway. Russell Hemingway is an old friend of John Kennedy's, was in the Navy with him, is a really terrific guy, big aristocratic, wealthy family from New England, and he ran a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress, and they would give funding to congressional candidates. He used to like to say, we fund liberals, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And so I give him a call, and I explained to him what had happened. And he said, Danny, he said, you got to go see Tip O'Neill right away. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He said, look, you got to go see Tip O'Neill. I'm going to give Tip a call right now. You just go on over there now. You go on over, and he'll see you. I'll give him a call. So you go on over there. So I did, and I go on over. We were only 10 blocks away. So I go over to the house, and I go into Tip O'Neill's office, and there's Tip. He's got his chief of staff with him, this guy in a wheelchair, and Russ had said, bring some copies of your complaint and give them to him. So I did. I handed him a couple of copies of the complaint, and he's leafing through it, and Tip O'Neill looks up at me and he says, gee, he said, if this is true, he said, why, these are impeachable offenses here. And I said, yeah, I thought so. And he said, he said, look, we're in charge, by we, he meant the Democratic Party. He said, we're in charge of the House of Representatives, but we're not in charge of the Senate. The Republicans still control the Senate. And so even if we were to return articles of impeachment, Peter Rodino is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, even if we were to return articles of impeachment, they'll never convict him, no matter what the evidence is. So we really need to wait until the elections this fall. This is 1976, right? This is like June 2nd or so of 1986. So he said, we have to really wait for the election here in the fall, and assuming we can take back the Senate, then what we'll do is we'll set up a special select committee to investigate the charges you've made here. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a complaint over, and I want you to go over and see Claiborne Pell. Claiborne Pell is the ranking Democrat from Delaware, or Rhode Island, and he is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so you go over and see him and give him a copy of this. I'll call him, let him know you're coming. So you just go on over there to see him and bring him a copy of the complaint. And what you do is you're going to ask him that if, in fact, we take back the Senate in the fall, would he agree to set up a special select committee to investigate these charges that you've made? And he's going to ask you, Dan, who do you think should head up that committee? And I want you to tell him, John Kerry. You want to appoint John Kerry? He loves John Kerry, he said. We kid him. He loves John Kerry so much, we all kid him that he must be his illegitimate child. He said he thinks John Kerry's going to be president someday. I laughed. I said, so does John Kerry, I said to him. And he laughed, and I laughed. And so I go over to see Claiborne Pell. We make the deal. He agrees to do it. I turn around, and I come back to my office, walk into my office, and Patty Austin, my secretary, she says, Danny, there's an older gentleman waiting for you. And I said, well, who is it? And she said, I don't know. He didn't give me his name. I said, well, where is he? He's up in your office and sitting there waiting for you. So I go upstairs, and this is now Monday, right? Or after we filed on Thursday. So I go up and I walk in, and here's this older guy sitting in a chair. I walk over to him, I stick my hand out, I say, hi, I'm Danny Sheehan. He said, yes, I know, thank you, it's good to meet you. He said, I just wanted to talk with you. And I said, he never told me who he was. So I said, okay. So he sits down, and I go over and sit down behind my desk. And he was like in mufti. He had these khaki pants on with the big pockets on the side, and he had it was all in mufti, like he had this fishing vest on with like about 18 pockets in it and stuff. And he had this hemp bag, like a little case on the side. And so I sit down, and he reaches into his bag, and he pulls out, he says, here, I've got a copy of your complaint here, he said, and I'd like to ask you some questions about this. He said, look, you don't have to answer them unless you want to. He said, but maybe I could help you out with this. And so I just, on an instinct, I said, okay, what? He said, look, of the 26 defendants that you've named here, who do you think is the most important of these? And he said, I said, that's easy. I said, it's Theodore Shackley. And he said, oh, really? And why would you say that? And I said, well, a lot of people would think it'd be because he was the ADDO. He was the Associate Deputy Director for Operations under George Bush when he was the director of the CIA. George Bush is now the Vice President. And Donald P. Gregg, who's his National Security Advisor, was the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez and Felix Rodriguez and Rafael Chichi Quintero, who are both running the Ilopango airlift operation of weapons to the Contras right now. And so that most people would think that's why he'd be the most important here. And he looked at me and he said, but that's not the main reason why you think he's the most important? I said, no. He said, what is that? And I said, because he was the CIA station chief in Miami on November 22nd of 1963. And he just stared at me like that. And he said, there aren't 5 men in the world that would have answered the question that way. And he gets up and he walks across this and he sticks his hand out. He says, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I think I could help you out. So that's how it started. That's how the big major investigation started that led to the discovery of what was really at the base of the Iran-Contra scandal. And I'll leave that for you till the next time. So that I'll give you one more example in our next class about what's really going on deep down beneath these types of constitutional crises that manifest in confrontations between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Okay, and that there's always a shallow explanation given for what the real problem is, but they try to avoid it, and all they want to talk about is the obstruction and the lying and the technical procedural rules that they violated by not cooperating with some investigation. And then they all pretend that they were really helpless. You see, we couldn't really get to the bottom of why this was really going on, but we do know that they were obstructing us and they were lying, and so we'll bring charges against them. And just remember that there were only 2 people, all the people that were charged by the special prosecutor in Iran-Contra were all pardoned by George Bush Sr. He pardoned them all at the direct advice of his Attorney General, William Barr. Okay? So let's get back together again next Tuesday. Thank you for bringing your papers in. We'll get on these right away. But start...
After class too.
Yeah, if you want to chat, that we'll be over next door at that little Cal conference room 132. But now, if nobody's going to come over, I want to know. So if anybody's going to come over, let me know. If you're not, then I've got lots of other stuff to do. I don't want to just sit around there and twiddle my thumbs for the next hour. Okay? Okay, so Grant will come. Okay? All right. All right, kids.